Welcome to Ketchi Gaming. I am Ketchi1383, and for part 3 of my Tears of the Kingdom review and commentary, I will cover the combat. In part 1, I said that it was very similar to that of Breath of the Wild. In some ways, that is not a bad thing. With a somewhat forgiving flurry mechanic as well as a shield parry making a return. And the combat is smooth and fluid. But there is an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed when it comes to the combat. That being the weapon durability and eventual shattering of every weapon in the game, and in its own way, even the Master Sword. I can't speak for everyone, but personally, I do not like how fragile the weapons are. In Tears, it gets a bit worse since the upheaval and the gloom causes all the weapons to degrade, reducing their damage. Now, there is a reason for the damage reduction, and that is due to the fusion ability. It is used to enhance a weapon's damage and durability. The problem I had is that I would avoid combat due to the weapons breaking. It only gets worse when it feels like the end game weapons, even when fused with some of the best monster parts, are still too fragile. Especially when the monsters start showing up as black and silver versions. Now let's focus on the fusion ability. Arguably, this is the main mechanic for combat in Tears. The fusion ability can fundamentally change how a weapon in the game functions depending on what you fuse to it. A sword can become a club by simply adding a Hinox horn, or you can fuse something you would never really consider to be viable and get a completely unexpected result, like adding a mushroom to a sword, giving it a bit of a bounce, causing enemies to go flying. There is a lot of experimenting to be done with the fusion ability, and I usually stuck with what worked for me, rarely using things like mushrooms on a sword. And there are no shortages of videos of people trying some very questionable fusions. But overall, the fusion ability did not change the melee combat all that much. There are some neat combinations, like adding a Lithos tail to a sword, making it more like a whip. But after a while, it is very apparent that some fusions, although fun or amusing for a bit, are not as practical, resulting in the use of monster horns like that of a White Lithos or Lionel to enhance a weapon. Then there are shield fusions. This allows shields to be used more offensively or even increase the defensive ability of a shield. And much like weapon fusion, it has its own unique outcomes depending on what you use to fuse to the shield. One I like to use is fusing a wing to a shield, giving Link more height when you do a shield surf, allowing you to slow down time to aim an arrow, while others do the same thing by other means, such as using the red barrel. But one thing I never thought of was fusing a piece of frozen meat to the shield, making it so Link can shield surf across flatter surfaces. Then there are the arrow fusions. Unlike melee weapons and shield, fusion does not affect the bow in the same way. Well, sort of. You could fuse a bow to a melee weapon, but it would lose its functionality. That's besides the point. Just like the melee weapons and the shields, the fusions have different effects on the arrows. The fusion for arrows is not as fun or unpredictable in comparison to the other weapon and shields, but seem to be more practical, with newly added items like fire fruit. Nintendo replaced fire arrows and other special arrows with the fusion ability. There are some neat fusions like fusing a Kisai, which will cause it to seek out the head of whatever enemy you're aiming at. This leads into the ability to throw items in your inventory as well, and the new items that were added along with the return of others. With the Sheikah Slate gone, along with the bombs Link could summon with it, Nintendo reintroduced bomb flowers, along with the previous mentioned fire fruit, but adding other elemental fruit as well. I almost expected to see a moss arrow in the game. Fusing, along with throwing items, adds more to combat than fusing items with melee weapons. One last aspect of combat I would discuss are the companions. Nintendo more or less took Link Wolf, RIP Link Wolf, and expanded upon the idea with the five sages. Each sage has a unique ability tied to the race, with Raiju probably being the most similar to that of Breath of the Wild. Their abilities to damage monsters is not that impressive, with them being effective against red and blue versions and then seeing a drop off for black and silver. For me, they handle the smaller monsters, in particular Tulin and his uncanny ability to get headshots. I personally feel that most of the abilities were not that great, hardly using them except for Tulin due to how his ability made it easier to explore or cover distances, while Raiju's is the best for combat, and Yun Obo's was handy if you ran out of bombs, but was not that effective in combat. He can be used as a weapon for any vehicle Link uses. Then there is Sidon, and I never used him outside of the first time his abilities were introduced. They are overall capable of handling weaker monsters, and in some cases can be used to great effect, but overall I turned them off because it made the screen feel cluttered. Now let's move on to the enemies. Let's face it, Breath of the Wild was rather lacking in terms of a variety of enemies. Tears sort of fixes this by adding new enemies and making older ones more distinguishable from their counterparts. Nintendo did this by changing the horns on their heads, with some very noticeable additions such as the Bokoblin bosses, the Horriblins, and the Aerocuda, and an enemy that has had various appearances in previous Zelda games, including the original Zelda, the Gleeok. The Gibdo also make a return, but have gone a significant change, in that they are less mummified corpses and more insect-like. Yes, you will still primarily encounter Bokoblins, Lithos, and Moblins, but at least there are other monsters that you can fight, and it was no different in previous Zelda games, let alone other games. Nintendo even went out of the way to change their attacks with the more prominent horn on their heads, and even adding armor made from rocks to a few enemies. I ran into a Lionel covered in armor in the depths. One last set of monsters I'd like to talk about are the bosses in the dungeons. Unlike Breath of the Wild, the bosses are unique for each dungeon. The problem with all the bosses is they are extremely easy to defeat. Caldera is probably the biggest pushover when it comes to the bosses, and is easily defeated. Caldera can be beaten with 6 arrows. Sorry, let me say 12 arrows, because you have to shatter the crystals on its body first. And can take maybe 2 minutes at the max to beat him. None of the bosses put up much of a fight, with the exception of Ganondorf, and his final form was easy as well. And since I'm on the topic of dungeons, let's talk about the dungeons and shrines. Another game element that felt very similar to Breath of the Wild is the Shrines of Light. They are similar in that you complete the shrine and get a Light's Blessing used to increase Link's hearts or stamina bar. The difference is they have puzzles based off of the new abilities and introduce new scenarios like the Proving Grounds. The puzzles are fun to solve and have multiple solutions, some of which I never even considered and thought Nintendo would have not allowed. Other than not using terminals like in Breath of the Wild, Link would still open a door to get to the boss, and the arc is the most egregious of them all, since it is very similar to Van Wadoa in a narrative sense. None were particularly hard. I will give Nintendo credit for adding a dungeon in plain sight for Minoru, and I would say there are more of them, with the castle being one and undergoing changes due to the upheaval, along with the path to Ganondorf being a dungeon in its own right. I would say the combat is still solid, and the fusion ability does make it distinct enough in comparison to Breath of the Wild. The shrines are fun to solve, along with a bit more variety in solving them or finding them, but a bit of a letdown with very easy puzzles and bosses. It was still fun to play, though. I will call it here. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching.